All right, so welcome everybody to this seminar. So I'm very excited to present today's topic. So as you can see from the title, turn your shell into a beautiful home. This is going to be about shell configuration. And this is basically a culmination of many years that I've played around with this, tried to set up my shell in a nice way. And so today I'm going to present to you the tools that I'm now mainly using. So for the setup, on the left you can see the GitHub repository, which will also be linked in the description here, showing the README, and on the right I have a terminal running. So I'm here on Windows now using WSL, but it doesn't really matter. And in addition, you can see here the keystrokes on the bottom right, so that you know what I'm doing, what I'm typing, and also as it's recorded, I think it's good that one can go back and see. So for a little outline here, so first I will show you how you can actually run all of these tools here that I provide via Docker. So this repository contains a Docker file from which you can build the image and run a container, or you can just run it directly from the GitHub container repository. Then what the fuss is about, so a little introduction, what we're going to cover, then showing you all the tools that I would like to present. So some turnkey solutions, the most important tools that I'm using right now and which have become really indispensable for me, some additional tools. Then I will hopefully manage to convince you why you should use Fish, which is what I'm personally using. So Fish stands for the Friendly Interactive Shell. Of course, I will also mention some caveats that apply. And lastly, honorable mentions. So in the original seminar, I didn't really go into detail here, but now as I have a bit more time, I will also present some additional tools here and acknowledgements in the end. So let's jump right into it. So for running the setup here via Docker, as I mentioned, you can either clone the repository and then build the image here from the Docker file and then run it, or just run it directly from the GitHub container registry, which is what we're going to do now. So let's just run this command here, and I already pulled this image before, so now we're straight in the container here. Also to mention this, you can see on the bottom here, actually it's shown that I have here for one the container as well as my personal local shell setup. So I might switch occasionally over there just because it's easier to show certain utilities as I've been using that extensively, whereas the container is really fresh, let's say. All right, so now what this is going to be about. So today we'll go on a journey from this here. So this you should all be familiar with this here. This is just the default terminal in Ubuntu here. And you can see Teams is very sad because, at least for me, I don't think this is a very nice kind of setup. And so where we will end up with after the seminar is something like this. So this is how it looks for me personally, showing here in the prompt a bunch of additional information. So you can see the directory, the Git branch, and additional Git information is actually shown here as well. The Python environment, so here the version, and if you're using a virtual environment, also the virtual environment that you have activated. Here the AIDA profile, so this is currently not really working in my plugin, so I need to figure that out. But in principle, I think that's also a very nice feature which I would like to have here, just to avoid that you're doing things in AIDA when you're in the wrong profile. So that might happen accidentally, so just this indicator here. And lastly, the time as well. And you can see here, for instance, if I run ls, it's not actually using the normal ls. Instead, it's showing here these symbols. So in addition to also the symbols shown on the top here, I am personally a big fan of that, just to get more information and have some visual candy here. It might be different for you. Of course, this is configurable without having all these symbols and this kind of stuff going on. Now, the spirit of the seminar is very much along these lines here. So why spend half an hour on a task if you can spend half a day automating it? So I think that many of you would agree with me that automating things is often more interesting and also might save you time in the long term. And so because we spend, I think all of us, lots of time in the terminal, I think it's worthwhile invest some time there to get a really nice setup that works well and is efficient. So yeah, this is what we're gonna see today. All right, now in principle, the setup here is I have this container here running with bash, Z shell, and fish installed. So if you start the container, this will be the case as well. All the tools I will show are installed in all three shells. I will start here with bash very briefly and then Z shell, but pretty quickly go to fish. However, it should work the same for you as well. So as I'm personally using fish, if you find some issues with the bash or Z shell installations, please raise an issue in the repository here. And yeah, with that, let's go right to it. So the first tools I would like to mention here are these Oh My configurations. So they exist for all three of those shells. I think Z shell was the first one, so Oh My Z shell here. There's also Oh My Bash and also Oh My Fish. I'm personally not actually using Oh My Fish here. I will show you what I'm using in a second, but just for completeness to mention it here. And these are basically custom configuration frameworks created by the community that provide a bunch of things such as themes, plugins, customization, etc. out of the box. And so I find those to be very useful because manually configuring, for instance, your bash RC takes time. You're very likely to break things and it's just quite cumbersome. So just installing one of these frameworks here is a very quick way to get a pretty nice setup out of the box without having to spend too much time manually configuring stuff. Because of course there comes a point of diminishing returns, which I have crossed a long time ago. So yeah, I really recommend using those. Now in the container here, all my bash is already running, so you can see here the prompt looks a bit different from how it would normally. You have this time here indicated, the directory that we're in, so we're in the IDA core directory here, and the Git branch that we're on. So yeah, just explore those, try them out, install them. So they are pretty widely used. So for instance here, Oh My Z shell is started by almost 170,000 people. So you can expect those frameworks to work and to provide reasonable defaults and plugins for you. Now, in addition here, on top of that, there's these what I call here prompt customization frameworks. I don't know if this is the right term, but these basically configure your prompt. So a very famous one that you might have heard of if you're using Z shell is power level 10K here. And usually on startup, one would have to configure that. To avoid the step here, I also copied the configuration file p10k.zshell in the repository, so it will be loaded in the container automatically. But in principle, this is also something you can install, and then you can customize your prompt. So if we enter here in the container, so now we're actually running bash. If we enter now Z shell, okay, it's not update here now. You can see, all right, your prompt already looks like this. So again, you have the time. In principle, the same information that we were seeing before, but just displayed in a bit of a nicer way. And for fish, I'm actually using Tide here. And so just to show you what fish is about, let's just install it right now. So using this command here, Fisher is a plugin manager for the fish shell, which is already installed in the container. We can just install here Tide. And if we do that, it actually installs a bunch of files and it asks us now if we want to configure the Tide prompt. So let's just go ahead and do that right now. And so it's going to ask us a bunch of customization options here that we will just go through. You can always select them using a number or yes and no. So yeah, feel free to tune that, of course, to your liking. So I personally like this classic style here. So let's choose that. True colors. You can always see what is actually being customized here on the top. Let's use a light color, then 24-hour time format. So let's use that. Then let's use a vertical prompt separator here, a sharp prompt head, flat prompt tail, 2 lines with a frame I personally like, disconnected frame. We don't need the frame on the right, I would say, so let's choose no here. Then the color shouldn't actually matter here. Now I like this sparse setup. Again, I like these icons, so this might be different for you. So let's choose the many icons for now. And here transient prompt, so this can be quite useful. Here you can see option number 2, this is the transient prompt. If you run multiple commands, then it doesn't show the prompt in between, and this can be useful if you want to run a few commands and want to copy what you ran, for instance, to file an issue on GitHub. So for this it can be quite nice. However, in my case I usually here don't enable that, so let's choose that, and that was basically it already now. So as you can see now, after following this, we have basically the setup as I was showing here now in the picture above before here. So already all of this is set up, and this took us now like 3 minutes, right? Of course, installation would otherwise have to be done, but as I mentioned in the container, things are already set up nicely. So now that we have fish set up here, this gives me an excuse to also use that from now on, but all the tools should work in the same way in the container. All right, now the 3 most important tools that I really use all the time now. The first one here is Tmux. So Tmux is a terminal multiplexer. And again, I added my personal configuration in this repository here so that the container works in the same way as it does for me on my local shell. Of course, you can tune that to your liking, but for me, the setup is pretty nice. I watched some tutorials or read online documentation, so I didn't really set it up all by myself, but in principle, it works now in, I think, a nice way. And so what Tmux does here is it basically allows you to have multiple terminals running without having to open, let's say, multiple instances of WSL or multiple terminal instances. For example, if you're running Ubuntu or using, tabs here. So we don't need any of this. We can organize all of our shells with Tmux. And now one thing that you can already see what I'm using Tmux for here is having this container running on one hand and my local shell on the other hand. And so these are what are called Tmux windows. So we can create a new one here, pressing Control A and then C for create. We can rename it Control A and now comma, let's call it test. And so this Control A here is this, I'm not sure if this is called leader key, but a certain key combination that you need to run for then executing Tmux commands. So by default, this is Control B. Control B, however, requires both hands, so Control A is just a little bit nicer to use. And so we can switch between these different windows here with Shift left and right. So this is also the setup in my Tmux configuration. We can close this here just normally with Control D. And now we can also split terminals here. So with Control A and then a hyphen, we can do a horizontal split. With Control A and the pipe, we can do a vertical split. And we can also navigate between those here with Alt up and down or Alt left and right. So we can nicely have multiple terminals running here and navigate between those. Now, these are basically called splits in Tmux here. Then you have the windows. However, the main entity of Tmux are called sessions. So if we detach from the session here now, pressing Control A, D, now we have detached from the session. We can show all the Tmux sessions that are set up here with Tmux ls. And so if we just reattach the session from before, you can see the container here is actually still running, as well as my local shell. And also the splits here are retained. So that's one of the nice features about Tmux actually, is that if you switch a session or even if you close a terminal, things are persistent. So that means the path that you are currently located in, as well as, for instance, if you open Vim here now, we detach, we attach again, you can see Vim is still open here in the same directory or on the same file. So this is very nice. I think if you, actually close a terminal or shut down your computer, of course the running container is not going to be persisted, but things like the path as well as Vim will be persisted. Another feature that I'm not really using, but I heard that it exists and people find it useful, is that Tmux can keep SSH connections open. So as I mentioned, I'm not really using that, but yeah, so this is the main advantage of Tmux basically, is being able to organize multiple shell sessions here and having things persistent. Now we can also switch sessions here, so there's a bunch more advanced features, which I cannot cover all of them here, but if you find it interesting, look into it. Now, the way that I usually use this is I have one tmux session for each project that I'm working on, and then maybe I'm working on different directories, different entities, or for instance here, once in the container, once in my local shell. So these are, I organize them then inside my tmux sessions. Now, the next tool here is Atuin, and Atuin replaces your shell history with an SQLite database. So this provides all the advantages that using SQL databases generally provide. So you have lots of nice and useful information being stored. Now, usually in just Bash, you would have your Bash history file, which you can grab for commands, etc. But with Atuin, you can search for your commands in a much nicer way. So I'm using here now my local terminal just because I ran more commands here and it's a bit nicer to show. Now with Atuin installed and set up, if we press the up arrow key, it shows us here the commands that we ran, how long they took to execute, and when we ran them. In addition, also with the return status, or basically if the command ran successfully or not. So you can see in red this command didn't run successfully, the other ones did. Now we can choose certain commands here by going up and down, or using Alt and the numbers that are annotated here on the left. So let's say Alt 3 brings us to this command which I just ran to start up the container. We can also search here now. So if we do, for example, git clone, then we can see, okay, which are the repositories that I recently cloned. And also a nice feature here is that the matching is actually fuzzy. So let's say git here, for instance, it matches this one here pretty nicely, but also git clone git. So you don't need to type exactly what you search for. You can have different ordering, different words individually. So this fuzzy matching is quite powerful, I think, and it will also come up more times now in the seminar. Now, in addition, so Atuin provides many features. I haven't explored all of them, but a very useful feature, I think, is the possibility to synchronize between workstations. So by default, without registering, you can just use Atuin locally and everything works. For a sync feature to work, you need to register, and then you get this synchronization key that you can then use to set it up on different workstations. And so by running Atuin sync here, you can synchronize from the remotely stored database of your commands. And this is very nice. For instance, if you have your workstation, you have your laptop, etc., you want to synchronize between those, you can do it like this. Now, for me, in principle, the idea is that if I learn a new tool, for instance, Docker, and I run a command successfully, I don't want to ever have to look that up again. Like, I don't want to have to Google that again, because I know in my history it will be recorded. Yeah, that's very nice, I think. All right, now the next tool here is actually quite similar. So this is zoxide, and this creates a database of your visited paths. So let's say we're now here again in the container, and we're in the AIDA core directory. So as you visit paths, they will get stored in the zoxide database. So in principle, they aren't there. So if we just type ZI for zoxide interactive, we don't have any match because we have nothing in our database. Now if we go up here, one directory, and then we go into AIDA core here. Now pressing ZI, well, we just have one match here, but okay. So let's do it differently. So I created this demo directory here. Now if we press ZI, we can see here, okay, we have this demo directory and AIDA core. Now let's go, for instance, here into directory 2 and subdirectory 1, and maybe we go back here and we go into directory 3. Now if we press, if we type ZI, you can see here, these are the paths that we visited so far, and they are recorded in the database. Also pretty nicely, you can see here immediately the contents of the directories in the bottom. Now, if we press the normal command for Z oxide, which is Z, and we type here core, so this would match from our database only Ada core. We pressed it, we jump directly there. So we don't need to, for instance, here otherwise have to go up once, go up twice, then type the path, etc. No, we can just do that from wherever we are. Now, if we go, for instance, a little bit deeper here, so let's go into tests, rockers. Okay, and there's nothing more here. So we're now in this a bit more nested directory, and the same way if we press Z3, for instance, here, which, as you remember here, is directory 3, we jump straight there. Or if we go now to rockers, we don't even have to type it fully, so it just matches here this BR, for instance, and we're here. So this allows you to very quickly and very efficiently navigate the file system for all the directories that you have already visited in the past. Of course, it doesn't store all of them by default, so it doesn't store your entire file system initially, but as you visit paths, they get recorded. Now you can also actually in this ZI here search. So if you type here core, okay, it's only gonna match those, so we can search for them. And also you can see here on the left, this number here is actually a score that is assigned to the directory, and this is based on the frequency of how you visit the directory and how recently you have visited it. So giving you here a certain score. If you now type just Z and core, it's gonna go to the highest match here. And maybe let's also go to, again here to demo directory 2 maybe. No, let's actually go to directory 3, and we have also here subdir 1. Now in our database we have 2 times subdir 1, so if we type Z1, yeah, it goes to the other match. So in principle, I don't use Z itself that much, but ZI here is very useful because it also gives you the choice to select which path of the database, and if there's only one match here, so for instance this blockers, it goes straight to this match. Now personally, I'm also using a Z here, and I'm going to show you what this does in my local shell. So this first of all allows me to alias CD to Z, which I think Z oxide doesn't really allow. So of course, if you have lots of muscle memory typing CD, it might be a little bit of a hassle to switch. So this is why I'm using Z, and it also gives me this tab auto completion here showing you all the different paths. Now, one thing that Z doesn't do is it doesn't purge paths which don't exist anymore. So if you were to rename this directory here, for example, this wouldn't be reflected with Z. With Z oxide, it does. So the Z oxide, if a path doesn't exist, it's not going to be stored anymore in the database. So yeah, like I said, I use actually both of them, but I think Z oxide here is very, very nice tool in and of itself. All right, now some additional tools here. So as you can see, if I type ls here now, so let's go back to core and type ls, you can see here that I get these symbols. So here these folders are shown, the configuration file, the markdown file here, they all get these symbols. And this is actually achieved by exa. So exa calls itself a modern replacement for ls. Apparently not that modern, because as I recently learned, it has been archived, and now the successor is eza. So don't ask me why. In the container, it's still exa installed, and I personally still use that. I haven't bothered switching the tool. And so actually, if we type here and type ls, you can see that actually I have this alias defined for ls is exa -- icons. So again, just defining these aliases for me is quite nice, because of course I have the muscle memory of typing ls. And so, however, this is the actual command here that provides this output. Now the next tool is actually quite similar to that. So it's called bat and calls itself a cat clone with wings, and it has syntax highlighting. So if we do, for instance, here cat for code coverage.yaml, of course cat for me being actually bat. We see here this YAML file, the output, same as we would get for cat, however with line numbers and syntax highlighting, and here also mirroring again which file it is. And for instance, if we go for, let's say, our arithmetic add calculation here, we do the same. So this is a Python file now. You can see now, okay, this is interactive because the file is actually too long to be displayed on screen, but you can see here also syntax highlighting for the Python file. So this works for all the most common programming languages. I would be very surprised if you have a use case where Xart doesn't have the syntax highlighting implemented. Now the next tool, enter, is also very interesting, I think. So to show you here, let's just go to my local terminal, because I already have some file here set up. And so this one is test.sh. And what enter now does is it allows you to run arbitrary commands on file changes. So this doesn't have to be the same file, it could also be different files. I will show that to you in a second. But in principle now, if you run enter here, the syntax is a little bit weird. So first of all, we need to use ls, or what I found to be more reliable is real path, and then the file that we want to actually track. And then we pipe that into enter, and then we say the command that we want to run. So this command down here basically means, okay, whenever test.sh changes, run this file here, test.sh with bash, right? Okay, if we do that now, you can see actually here on the top, there's already this echo hello in the test.sh file. If we now uncomment, the second line here and we save the file, you can see that now actually both statements are printed. So this change here is immediately executed in the file that is executed. Now one note of caution here is to not do dangerous things if you work like this, because as soon as you save your file, it will get immediately executed. So if we save here, this last line will be printed. Now, this can be dangerous, so if you are doing some rm-rf business in the file here, maybe best not to use enter for that case or in that moment, because if you mess something up and you save your file, it will get executed. Also here to mention, you don't have to necessarily edit the file here via Vim or something like this. You could use VS Code, and now if you have autosave set up in VS Code, autosave might save your file, and you might execute some code that you didn't intend to be executed. So just be wary of that. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't even have to be the same file here. So we can say real path test2.sh, and then we execute test.sh. So let's just comment this line out here, and we save the file, and we exit. And now we added this test.sh, test2.sh file here. Let's just add a new line and save the file. And now as soon as we save test2.sh, the file changes. Enter is picking up on that because we provide here test2.sh, the path. We pipe it into enter, and it's going to execute, however, test.sh. So yeah, so you could put any file here that you want and any other file here that you want. And one use case where I actually was using that quite a lot was when developing for the AIDA Verdi command line interface. So I was tracking here the original Python file that contained the implementation, and I was then executing here the respective Verdi command just to see if the changes in the Python file do in the command line interface what I intend them to do. So I don't know if I still have that here. Yeah, so for instance, here I was editing some Python file. Actually, this is actually the same Python file that I'm executing here, but you can see it doesn't have to be bash. You could also run Python, so whichever command. And in addition, yeah. Okay. In addition here, you can also run more complex commands rather than just bash or Python. And this you can do by providing this sh for shell minus c for command here. And here actually I was modifying a Python file, and then whenever I save that Python file, I was running the mypy pre-commit action or pre-commit run here on this file. So you can get quite complex here. What it allows you to do basically is having to switch between your editor and the terminal to execute the command that you want to run, or to run the file. And so here the switching is pretty quickly, but you could imagine if you have VS Code running and then you have your terminal in a separate instance here, it might be a bit annoying to have to switch between both. And so this is what Enter allows you to avoid. Now the last tool here in this section is actually a Git plugin I would like to show. And so this is part of the All My Z Shell configuration. So as I mentioned before, they contain a bunch of plugins. So this is one of them. And in Fish, there's also an implementation which is actually inspired by the Git plugin for Z Shell. So oftentimes these different shells, certain tools that are implemented in one shell eventually also get implemented for the other shells. And so what this allows us to do is just use aliases here that are defined in the plugin. So if I say GST, it automatically extends to git status, or GFA, here git fetch all prune. So I don't really know all of those in principle by heart, but in a second we will figure out how we can actually explore them, apart of course from looking at the documentation. So again, this just allows you to save some keystrokes here, especially for commands that you run all the time, without having to go and manually define these aliases, right? You could also, of course, do that, but installing the plugin might just be a little bit quicker. Now, here, this is a kind of a good point here now to go towards Fish. So certain features of Fish which I would like to highlight. So I've been using it already now, and maybe some things you have seen already and were wondering where they come from. And one of those things here and that I really like about Fish is that it underlines existing paths and files. So no such file or directory errors when you run your command is going to be a thing of the past. So let's say we want to cd here into tests and then maybe Brockers, and we misspell that, right? So we type it and we misspell it. Now you can see it's actually highlighted in red here, and importantly not underlined. So whenever a certain part of the path is actually existing, it's underlined by Fish out of the box. So here tests Brockers is underlined, and we know this exists. Now the file inside, well, actually there's no file inside, but if you say no cat, for example, the only file that exists here is test rabbitmq. Now if we type that and we say rabbitmc, it's not underlined, it doesn't exist, and we know that before we run the command. Now another feature that you might have seen already is if I now type, for instance, here git, it already shows you in gray. Maybe let's make that a bit bigger actually. It shows you in gray already here in the previous command that you ran. And so these auto-completions I find quite useful, just because I often rerun the same commands quite frequently, and then I don't have to type them out anymore. So for instance here our real path, let's rerun that in the okay, it doesn't show it here for some reason. Well, anyway, so for other commands, so in principle this should work here. Whenever you run a certain command, it shows you what you ran before, starting with in the same way here in gray. You can now either press to the right, so the right arrow here to take the full auto completion, or just control right, and then it's gonna just match it word by word what you typed before. Now this is a feature that you get in Fish out of the box. However, there's also a plugin in Z Shell that allows for that. So as I mentioned, these tools very often inspire each other. Now, I mentioned in the beginning that FISH stands for Friendly Interactive Shell. And just to show you one reason, for example, or how this is reflected, is how you can configure the fish shell. So you can type here fish config, and this opens here this new tab in the browser. It shows you a bunch of stuff in the terminal that we don't care about. And here you can, for instance, select certain color themes that are defined out of the box for fish, a bunch of prompt customizations. So it's not being shown here because I'm using Tide. However, there's various ones that are defined out of the box here. You can see your functions. So for instance, as I mentioned before, I have lots of these aliases here. So cat is actually aliased to bat, or here ls actually alias to exa minus minus icons. So just nice to see your aliases and your functions that you have defined like this. Similar variables. So if I search here for AIDA project, you can see, of course, I'm using AIDA project for everything AIDA related here, and the AIDA project directory, also the AIDA virtual environment directory, etc. So just nice to have this interactive search. Similarly, you can search for the history here. However, you don't really need this if you are using Arduino. So you have a much more advanced tool at your disposal. But just to show you that I think this is quite a nice interactive way to customize your shell, see what you have defined, such as functions, variables, etc. And just a showcase of some of the nice features of Fish. Now, if we close this tab here, we press enter. Now we're outside of that and everything back to normal. Now, as I mentioned before, so these plugins here, such as the Git plugin, provide lots of these aliases here, but you might not immediately know which those are. And so Fish provides an interactive command line or command line option search. And so how this works is if we press now, for instance, only G, because we know that all the Git commands are going to start with Git, with G, and we press tab, then we get here a list of all the commands that start with G, which are defined. So these are quite many, 300 something. Now, if we press Control S, we actually get this interactive search here for these commands. Now we can search for git commit, for example. And here you can see now on the left, these are all the abbreviations that are actually defined by the Git plugin. So just normal git commit amend, etc. So many of those, which I have personally never used, but I find this useful, first of all, to explore which options there are. The search is also very powerful. So if we search here, for example, for branch, we get all the branch commands. And often I use this feature and then I actually learn something new. So for example, if we use here this git fetch minus minus all minus minus prune, so git fetch all I have used before, but if I search here now via this interactive search, I search for fetch, maybe all, and then I see, okay, this command here, and also contains this minus minus prune option. Maybe I wasn't aware of this minus minus prune option. Maybe it's useful, right? So I have learned quite a lot of things by just exploring that. And another showcase here also is it doesn't only work for the commands themselves, but also for command line options. So if you press ls minus and then tab, then we can see here, okay, these are all the options for ls that we have. We can again also search. So let's say we want hidden, and then we can see, okay, ls minus a shows you all the hidden files. And now, for example, I didn't know about this. Here you also have this minus almost all option here, which okay, just doesn't show you the period and double period for the current working directory and the parent directory, but still, so maybe something nice to, this doesn't actually work because I'm using exa, but in principle, just very nice to learn about these features here via this interactive search capability. Now, a very nice additional tool here. So I mentioned fuzzy matching before, and fuzzy matching is a concept or a feature that is implemented in many, many different places. So also the command palette of VS Code and the file switcher uses fuzzy matching to match commands and file names based on what you type. And so fzf in and of itself is just a command line utility, which is also installed, of course, in the Docker container. And it allows you, for instance, here, if you cat this file and you pipe it into fzf, giving you this interactive search window again here, where you can search, for example, for the Pydantic version, if you care about this here. Or here you can see the fuzzy matching in place. So if I type Pydan, it matches as a highest match here, of course, Pydantic, but it also matches this project entry points AIDA node. So you can see here also individual characters are being matched. So this is the concept of fuzzy matching. Now, I don't usually use fzf in this kind of way. I mean, of course, one could also grab Pydantic, but using fzf here is very useful if you don't know exactly what you're searching for. So grab is only going to match the exact match, or of course, if you use regex, you can make that more flexible. But here, this fuzzy matching is very flexible overall to find what you're looking for. And now, on top of that, there's an fzf plugin for the fish shell, which I find very, very useful. So what you can do with that is you can use certain mnemonic key bindings to search for certain entities on your computer. So for instance, Control-Alt-F for files shows you now here all the files in the directory. Again, it gives you this nice interactive search capability here, and on the right also showing you a preview of the file, which I find very nice. So I mean, now the screen is a bit small, but if we make it full screen, this becomes very, very useful, and you can go here through the files and see if this is actually what you are looking for. So for example, here the test, what it contains, etc. Then if you enter, it expands to this path, and then we could edit it with Vim, for example, or use other tools here. In addition, so there's a few of those key bindings here. Another one I would like to show is Control-Alt-P, which gives you a fuzzy search for system processes. So we can see here Docker. Okay, Docker is running. This is the container here in our other Tmux window. And yeah, so I use this by times to just quickly search for certain processes that are running. Yeah, there's more of those. So these are just two I would like to show. And lastly here now, shameless self-promotion of my AIDA Fish plugin. So this is also very much inspired by the Git plugin I showed before, and provides mnemonic key bindings for the Verdi command line interface of AIDA. So if we type here VST, actually I thought, okay, in the local it doesn't work right now, I don't know why, but in the container it works. So if we say VST, for example, it expands to Verdi status, right? Or for example, VPL, Verdi process list. Okay, don't have anything set up there right now. Or a Verdi culture, go to computer here. And so these also, I think, are very logical. So it's usually the first character here of each command. And so there's also Verdi code, Verdi computer. So for Verdi computer here, I'm using CML. So VCML is Verdi computer list, or VCOL is Verdi code list. And again, here the search functionality becomes very useful. So we can just type V, press tab, and then use the search here. So we want only Verdi commands, might not even be useful to type that, and then computer. You can see here these are all the commands which I have defined, so they should just mirror the complete Verdi CLI. Of course, need to be updated as we release new versions of AIDA. But yeah. And now we can see, for example, here, so we can search here for computer, and we see the different options. So delete or kill, these are things that one needs to actually type out fully, just for safety reasons. But yeah, so I think this might also be useful for new users who maybe don't really know all the things that are there in the Verdi CLI, and they can explore it like this. Of course, they can also just run Verdi - help. But yeah, just allows you to not having to type out these commands that you probably are using quite a lot. Now, also to mention here, to be honest, some caveats for the fish shell. So for one, fish is not POSIX compliant. So it contains it contains a bit of a different syntax. So for instance here, if we run this for loop here in fish shell, so this works. And if you're familiar to bash syntax, you might recognize that here the do is missing, and we actually end this construct here with done rather than with end rather than done. So if you're used to bash syntax, this might require learning this other new syntax, might lead to some errors. Personally, I find the syntax nicer because this do here to me that you need in bash just seems a little bit redundant. So in fish you don't need that. And also here all the constructs end with end, so this is very simple. You don't need phi or esac or other constructs that you have in bash. But yeah, it's different, so this is something that one should be aware of. However, I don't think this is too much of a problem because you can still run normal bash commands by just running bash and then, or scripts by just running bash and then your script. And you can also always just enter a bash terminal session by just typing bash. Same with Z shell. So just by using fish, it doesn't exclude you from running bash commands or using commands that follow bash syntax. So if you need to run a command that uses bash syntax, maybe you've copied a very long command from the internet and you're too lazy to modify it, you can just enter bash here, you paste your command, and then you execute it, and you can go back to fish shell, for example. And in addition to this, configuration of fish is also different. So fish doesn't use a fish RC file. So from bash, you might be familiar with this bash RC file here. In fish, however, you have instead this config fish. So this config.fish file, which is in home.config fish. So this is a quite modern way where applications store their configurations in this .config directory in home. So fish also adheres to that. So that being said, configuring things by yourself might therefore also be a little bit cumbersome, or you might need to learn new things. Also the way how fish sets environment variables. But overall, I think the syntax is actually much nicer in the way of doing things. But yeah, just be aware of that. If you don't want to enter this rabbit hole, just stay with Z shell. You can customize it to work basically the same as fish, almost, or you can just use the Docker file. And then there you have all the setup nicely done. And if you like something, of course, you can then install it on your own machine. So this I already mentioned here. All right, now the last tools here. So I didn't actually mention those too much in the seminar, but now here for the recording, I can spend a bit more time on those. So for one, there's this GitHub command line interface called GH here, which allows you to do lots of GitHub related things. So in addition to just the Git commands here, which you have in principle, this is really GitHub specific things. So you can manage issues here, pull requests, releases, repositories, etc. So just very nice. You don't have to do that in the browser here on GitHub directly, but you can do it in your shell. And it also provides here this GH act extension that you need to install, and then you can run GitHub actions locally. I'm not actually using that too much right now, but it might just be nice to run those locally before you push to a repository. So one use case, for example, here for me was writing some Python script, which worked nicely. So all the tests were passing locally, the pre-commit ran through, and then I pushed it to the repository, and then something failed. And the reason why it failed was that via the GitHub action, it was also trying or testing the code with different Python versions. And so I was missing certain code here to make it run with an older Python version. And so instead, if you use GitHub act to run the GitHub actions locally, you might catch that before you push it. You don't get notifications on GitHub that your GitHub actions failed, etc. Now, the rest of the tools here are actually some optional dependencies of Astro NVim that I'm going to spend some time here as well in a few minutes. So I don't really use them too much directly in the terminal, but here within AstroVim. So for one, FD, a simple, fast, and user-friendly alternative to find. So for most of these command line utilities, default command line utilities, there exists exist more advanced kinds of version nowadays. So if you're into that, feel free to install them. If you're more minimalistic, just keep using the default ones. I showed you exa before for ls and bat for cat. There's also fd for find. Then there's ripgrab, which is just by default a recursive grab, and that also allows regex search. So if we search here, for instance, this pattern here, so CL for class, and then the regex here dot period and star, and then multiply add, we get here all these recursive matches, and it's very fast. So I find ripgrab very useful, and I basically always use that now instead of grab. Now lazy git, so this I will just show also with Astra NVim. And then GDU is disk usage analyzer. So you can see here in the repository which directories have the most space requirements. Here, if we go inside tests, we see all the other subdirectories, so you can go through the hierarchy here. Always you see how much disk space is being used. You can even do that for all of home. So yeah, this is just quite a nice tool here for looking at your disk usage. Similarly, here is this tool, bottom. So if we start for process or system monitor, the default one would be top, right? So you're probably all familiar with this. And then on top builds htop, so then you can use that one here to see what's going on. And then bottom is, let's say, the next evolvement or iteration of that, which I find is just visually quite appealing and quite nice. So yeah, just a little nice visual candy here, nice additional tool. And lastly, so Astra NVim. So this is basically a NeoVim configuration on steroids. And so it uses NeoVim, not normal Vim. And before going into that, I would just like to say that, so for me personally, it will never replace VS Code, I think, because VS Code just provides so many functionalities out of the box, and they're just very easy to set up. Or basically you have extensions for everything in VS Code, right? So more advanced things such as Docker or remote, that being either remote tunnels or remote SSH. For all of those, you have extensions in VS Code, and you just install them and they work out of the box. Whereas in NeoVim or Vim in general, configuring things is a little bit more cumbersome. So I wouldn't use Astra NVim exclusively. I would still do heavy development in VS Code. However, it's quite a nice alternative to just using the custom Vim. And similar to these turnkey solutions I showed in the beginning, the oh my configs, you don't really need to set up much for Astra NVim. It's really also one of these community projects where they did everything for you. And it basically allows you to have Vim look something like this here. So it really becomes a full IDE. Also here I should add that customizing things yourself, in addition to this community configuration you get by installing Astra NVim, requires Lua. So this is the language that is used in Astra NVim for configurations, and so I personally am not familiar with Lua. I don't really want to learn a new programming language just for customizing things. If you're familiar with that, it might not be a problem, but so this just to mention here. And to show you now some of the features of Astra NVim, I'm just going to start that here in full screen, and we're going to open the AIDA core repository. Now there's this concept here in Astra NVim of a leader key. I don't know if this is also in normal Vim, but here this is basically space. So if you press space, we get a bunch of options here, also which keyboard key we need to press. And so, for example, we can find stuff and we can find files, for example. So we get here, we type add.py, similar to this FZF fish plugin. On the left, the file that matches here, and on the right, a preview of the file. Pretty nice, I think. All right, now we have the file opened. Now we can, of course, not only search for files, but also for words or content in the files. So then we need to press W here now, and we can search for a class arithmetic add calculation. Also, interestingly here, if you have multiple matches in the same file, so in this test utils file, we have multiple matches. They are highlighted here on the right in this preview. So yeah, I think that's also a very nice way to just explore a certain repository. Apart from using VS Code and doing a global search, of course, but this feature here for me can be quite useful to explore a code base. Now we can also show here the Explorer on the right. So you have the full, like a full file manager also installed here. Yeah, I'm not really using that too much. I should actually learn about this, but just to show you that it exists, so you can actually also navigate to certain files like this. Now, as I mentioned before, so you can tune Astro NVim to become a full IDE, but this requires a little bit of manual setup, which is not too crazy, but just to show you here. So what is used in Astro NVim is this tool called Mason. And so if you make this double dot here and then type Mason and we enter, we see running here mason.nvim. And you can see here what I have installed. So I've installed the black formatter for Python and rough. Now this shows you here all the available tools, which are over 400. So if you want to filter that with Control F, and we just search for Python, now it only shows the tools that are available for Python, and these are all the tools. And if we press 2 here now, instead it just shows us LSP, so language server protocols. Here debug adapter protocol, linters, formatters, etc. And then we can just, for instance, here let's check LSP. So this is not going to work, but just to show you, install. So pressing enter here expands that. You see the GitHub repository, you see the language and what kind of tool it is. You can collapse it again with enter, and if you press I, then it's going to install that. So it doesn't work here because I don't have npm set up. But in principle, if you have npm installed, then this works. And so I find that quite useful here, this kind of configuration for actually learning stuff, because in VS Code you just install the Python extension and you're done with it and you don't care, which is very nice. But for learning a little bit more about how these things work in the background, actually configuring stuff via this route in NeoVim or Astro NVim here allows you to learn more things. So for example, I wasn't really aware about LSPs, language server protocols, until I actually explored this here in Astro NVim. I also didn't really know about rough. Right, so the default that is installed in VS Code is this Pyrite here, which is also developed by Microsoft. Okay, can I show it now? Yeah, so in principle I wanted to expand this here, but it doesn't work anyway. So you can learn about new tools here, such as rough. So I didn't know about that. I found out about rough by just exploring the different tools here. For example, if we go to formatters here, so one that you might be familiar with is YAPF here, or also AutoPep8, etc. So lots of nice tools to just explore there and learn about them. All right, now once we have these things installed, so I have now this rough LSP installed, so that provides me a bunch of these LSP capabilities. If we press here spacebar and then L for LSP, then we can get this symbols outline here by pressing uppercase S, which shows us here the class, arithmetic add calculation, the methods that are define and prepare for submission, and variables inside of here, for instance calc info, and we can select those and we can jump to them. Another feature here similar is that we can search symbols with a lowercase s. So the same way here, we can search for symbols. We can search here, okay, class arithmetic add calculation, or also code info. And again, always very nice, the preview here on the right, so that we know where we end up if we actually choose that here. Then we jump to this object. Now, I mentioned before lazy git, so I think it's an interesting concept. Personally, I haven't looked too much into it, but if you press spacebar and then G for git, as you can see in the bottom here, we can actually, well, we can in principle do a bunch of git options here, but we have also this option here, toggle term lazy git. So if we do that here now, it opens a new terminal with lazy git. So we can see here in these different panels here, so here's files, so these are the currently added files so that we're modifying, so these are the file changes. We can navigate these panels here with numbers, so if you press 2, 2 should be files, but 3 is then local branches. Also showing us here, okay, upstream is gone, so this apparently is not on GitHub anymore. We can press 4 to go here to the commits. We can go to the stashes with 5, 6. So 6 would be this panel, but you cannot really choose that because this is just showing you the information about whatever you have selected. So for example, here in the local branches, shows you the recent commits. So I think this is quite a nice feature. There's many more things one can do with lazy git. So by pressing question mark, you can see all the shortcuts here. So I haven't bothered actually learning all of those so far, but if you're really a keyboard warrior, then this might be interesting for you as well. So I think this concludes what I wanted to show about Astro NVim. So installing it should take few minutes, couple of minutes, just downloading the configuration. And then this, I think, is a much nicer tool than just using plain Vim. Now, for installing stuff, all the installations are in the Docker file. So if you use a Docker container to try out some of these tools, that you can do that very easily. And then in the Docker file, you will see all the installation instructions. So maybe if I manage, I can just go there. Yeah, exactly. So we're here now. Okay, so let's just open the Docker file. So this is rather large, so 180 lines. And if we search here now, for instance, for Arduino, okay, yeah, so you can see here, okay, this is the command that I ran. So just pulling from the repository here and piping into bash this installation script. So very simple. And for just installing it on your local machine, you just remove these Docker directives here, which are the uppercase commands in the beginning. And yeah, so I think this Docker file for me, it was a very nice learning experience actually creating this. For you, it's nice because you can try it out, and it also really compiles in one place all the installation that you need for all of this. Because of course things might not work out in the beginning, so I spent quite some time installing all of this, making everything work. But now you find here really a compiled version of everything ready to be used. And I'm using the Ubuntu 22 base image, which doesn't contain really many fundamental, let's say, tools. Like it doesn't contain Vim, it doesn't contain Git. So this is really a bare bone installation that we're starting with from here, and installing basically everything, really building up this this container here. So this should work on Ubuntu 22 if you're running that. On other operating systems, of course, things might change. But yeah, this is specific for Ubuntu 22. So yeah, feel free to explore the Docker file and take the commands here to actually install things for you. Now, before I go to the acknowledgements, I actually realized one tool I forgot to mention for Arduino is here in this Arduino stats, which shows you statistics about your database of commands. So if I run this here now, okay, so I work now for the AIDA development team, and Verdi is my most used command, so pass the test. Yeah, just to show you that. So there's many more things with Arduino that you can explore. All right, now for the acknowledgements. So especially when creating the Docker file, I use GPT-4 and GitHub Copilot quite a lot. I'm not too familiar with Docker yet. So like I said, this was a very nice learning experience. And really, there's many kind of stupid tasks that one can automate using these large language models. So for example, I had having these aliases here defined, for example, so having these aliases here, for instance, defined for fish. So I had those because I'm using fish, and then just copy pasted into GPT-4 and told it, okay, just make the same for Bash and Z shell, and it did it for me. And also just to make sure that everything works. So these are very valuable, and I use them quite a lot here for this purpose. Then as well, I would really like to thank Paul Sanz, this guy here. So he's a PhD student at the group of Professor Nuria Lopez, where I also did my PhD. And he was the one who converted me to use Fish. And so hopefully I will continue his legacy and manage to convince some of you to also use Fish. And lots of the tools he told me, or we discussed them. So we had the Software Treats Slack channel in our group, which was mainly, not only, but quite a lot, just him and me talking about these kinds of shell customization tools. So yeah, big shout out and thanks for him, and to all of you for listening to this rant.